This is a fascinating machine. What is it?
This is the Atavachron. I'm sure you'll find something here that pleases you.
This appears to be an archive or library of some kind.
You are listening to the Tricorder transmissions.
You may select from more than 20,000 various tapes.
And now, here are Jeff and Claire.
The library serves no purpose unless someone is using it.
Hello again. Thanks for beaming aboard the Tricorder transmissions for our third Atavachron episode. Tonight on the show, we will be discussing the real world's influence on the original series finale, Turnabout Intruder. I'm Jeff Hewlett, and sitting immediately to my right is my indispensable co-host, Claire Little.
Hello.
How are you, Claire?
I'm doing well. How about you?
I'm doing quite well myself. It's nice to be here with you yet again.
Yes, thank you. You too.
Oh, thank you. And you chose this episode, and why don't you tell us a little bit about why you chose Turnabout Intruder?
Well, I think Turnabout Intruder is one of those episodes that pretty much everyone has a strong opinion about for different reasons, maybe. And it's an episode that I think while we all talk about it and maybe dismiss it, I think a lot of people forget that it is the last episode of the original series.
Mm-hmm.
So it's maybe a little bit of a dubious legacy for the original series, but I think it's an episode that's a bit of an onion. There are a lot of layers to it and things that you might sort of immediately have a reaction to. If you sit and think about it, maybe they're leading in a different direction than it seems, intentionally or unintentionally by the writers or the show. And I also think it's an episode that maybe more than any other looks dramatically different to a viewer in 2015 than a viewer in 1968. And there are a lot of episodes where we point out that, maybe technology or the special effects don't hold up, or the sort of future history has proven false, as eugenics wars, for example, never took place. But I think more than any other episode, this one shows just how different our time is now from the time when this originally aired. Personally, I would love to talk to someone who watched this show in 1968 and remembers watching it and remembers their reaction to it. I think that would be really interesting. Unfortunately, I don't know anyone around that I can talk to about that. So,
well, I do know somebody who watched this
great.
in 1968, and unfortunately, or 1969 rather, and unfortunately, that episode was preempted in its original broadcast. So the original broadcast never actually got to be seen in its entirety, and it wasn't actually seen until it was rebroadcast in syndication down the road. So that would complicate matters a little bit more.
I did not know that. Do you know how much of the episode was preempted?
I do not know exactly. There's some details in Mark Cushman's book about it. It wasn't very much of the episode that got out. I want to say something about 20 minutes or so. And I remember
the last 20 minutes?
No, the first. And the first 20. And my uncle, actually, is my source. He remembers it because he saw all of the original episodes when they were airing. And he remembers that really upsetting him that he didn't get to see the entire final episode until syndication sometime later.
That's very interesting. I did not know that about that episode, and I'm trying to think those first 20 minutes are crucial in terms of understanding the plot, certainly, but there's also some very interesting dialogue in the first 20 minutes that I think informs a lot of sort of the impressions that maybe the viewer gets from the rest of the episode. So that's really interesting.
Yes, yes. Something that I didn't think much about until I was preparing for this discussion with you, we don't see in the original series, women in positions of authority, but one woman that we did see in a position of semi-authority was in the original pilot, The Cage, and Jeffrey Hunter, who played Pike, actually passed away a week before Turnabout Intruder aired. And the original pilot is the only time we ever saw a female in Starfleet in the original series in a command role on a starship. So it's a strange connection.
We're jumping ahead a little bit, but I think it's fine. Another person that I would love to have talked to or been able to talk to about this episode is Majel Barrett, because she obviously she played number one, the character that I think you're referring to.
Yes.
And she is better known probably for her role as Nurse Chapel on the original series. And Nurse Chapel is in the episode Turnabout Intruder.
Mm-hmm.
She doesn't really have a lot of dialogue, but she's present in a lot of scenes. And I would really have loved to have known if she had any impressions or thoughts on the difference between the way women in authority are portrayed in Turnabout Intruder versus her short-lived role as number one. Also interesting to note, Gene Roddenberry wrote the story for Turnabout Intruder, and he also created the character of number one. So there's also, that was interesting to me. I had forgotten that he wrote the story for this episode. He did not actually write the episode, though. I don't know how much of the dialogue and the specifics of the storyline come from Roddenberry or come from the screenwriter. That's also an potentially important distinction there, but that's interesting to note. So I guess we should just start talking about the episode itself. I would like to throw a disclaimer out there, or I guess gender pronouns are going to be really confusing in this episode, I think, while we talk about it. And so I'm just hopefully going to stay consistent. I think whoever is in Kirk's body, whether it's Kirk or Dr. Lester, that person is going to be referred to as a he. And whoever is in Lester's body, I think I will probably refer to as a she or as a woman.
Okay.
And I guess to keep the characters themselves, their personalities in check, or not in check, but to make them easy to reference, we have Kirk, who is mentally and physically Kirk, Dr. Lester, who is mentally and physically Dr. Lester, and then, I don't know, Lester Kirk is Dr. Lester in Kirk's body, and Kirk Lester I don't know. It's very confusing. My notes have Kirk Lester and Lester Kirk written all over them. So I hope that we're not too confusing for this, and I hope that our pronoun usage is appropriate according to what the listener is thinking of. So when we say she, they think of who we're thinking of. I hope so.
I hope so too.
Yeah, this is going to be a little confusing. But anyway, so I think people are probably familiar with the plot. The quick and dirty version is that Dr. Lester, who is a woman who is one of Kirk's loves from Starfleet Academy, tricks Kirk into basically swapping bodies with her. So her mind goes into Kirk's body and Kirk's mind goes into her body. And the Dr. Lester in Kirk's body version of Kirk then becomes bent on either basically destroying. Yeah, this is already confusing. Lester Kirk is bent on destroying Kirk Lester. I don't know. The person in Kirk's body, this is going to be hard. Okay, so despite my previous statements of Lester Kirks and Kirk Lesters, which it's very ungainly to use, if we say Kirk, we mean Lester's body. Wait, what did we decide?
So when we make a reference to, Kirk spends most of the episode in Dr. Lester's body, and Dr. Lester spends most of the episode in Captain Kirk's body. So I think if we just refer to them as their name, so when we say Dr. Lester, we're talking about
their mental self.
Right. Their physical self will be the opposite.
Okay,
so whenever we say Dr. Lester, we're talking about her in Kirk's body and vice versa.
I will stick with that as best I can.
Okay.
So once Dr. Lester is in Kirk's body, she spends basically the entire episode, number one, attempting to be Captain Kirk and be the captain of the Enterprise. And number two, to kill the body of Janet Lester that contains Kirk's his self, for two purposes. One is to allow her to continue to be Captain Kirk, and the other is as punishment for, basically, she's become obsessed with Captain Kirk and hates him and wants to punish him. And as an episode, I think generally the plot is fine. I mean, it's kind of a pretty standard sci-fi plot idea. And I also think that the fact that it's men and women switching bodies is also an interesting and a pretty standard sci-fi idea. But where this episode tends to get pretty touchy is the gender politics at play in this episode are really blunt, and to a 2015 audience, and maybe also to an audience in 1969, a little, the audience might have some issues with them.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And one thing that I think is kind of interesting is that most of the worst lines of dialogue actually come from Dr. Lester herself talking about women, which is interesting. And I guess I'll just jump right into it.
Sure.
So as soon as Dr. Lester manages to switch bodies, and so she's in Captain Kirk's body, and Kirk is in Dr. Lester's body, and Kirk is laying in bed in a weakened state, Dr. Lester stands over Kirk and says, "Now you know the indignity of being a woman," which is, I think an extremely interesting line of dialogue that could have lots of different possible meanings. Dr. Lester apparently has always wanted to be a captain in Starfleet, or always wanted to be in a position of authority, and she can't. Kirk says that the year we were together at Starfleet was the only time in my life I was alive. And her response is, "I never stopped you from going on with your," or he says, I'm sorry, "I never stopped you from going on with your space work." And her response is, "Your world of starship captains doesn't admit women." I would love to know how that line is meant. Does that literally mean Starfleet does not allow female captains? Or is it more of a, everyone knows the captain's true first love is their ship, more of a there's no room in your life for me kind of thing? It's, as far as I know, never explicitly stated, perhaps beyond that line of dialogue, that women cannot be captains in Starfleet. And I'm still not sure by the end of the episode if they really can't be captains by the end of Starfleet, or if Dr. Lester herself could not be a captain because she's clearly insane. So I don't know.
Well, I love to debate the two possible meanings, but I think Gene Roddenberry himself actually admitted that a lot of the dialogue was supposed to be sexist in nature.
Okay.
I originally wanted it to be a not a sexist thing, just because of Star Trek, of course, because of our love for the show. But well, the line itself about the indignity of being a woman, looking at Lester's past, I mean, she was an esteemed scientist, so esteemed that she was given command of this operation on Camus 2. She was allowed to hold a leadership role in that expedition. So there was some confidence in her leadership ability on behalf of Starfleet, right? But it must be that they weren't allowing women to ascend past. There must have been some sort of a glass ceiling there in place where you could get to a certain rank, and that was pretty much where you got stuck. And I think that, judging by her anger at the situation, that she felt that was an undignified way to treat her and people like her.
Yeah, and I think that is probably the most, I think there are many maybe underlying meanings, but I think that is definitely the primary meaning of that line of dialogue. I also think there's maybe a secondary meaning, which is no one's going to believe you because you're a woman. So part of the indignity of, in her perception of being a woman, is being capable, being fully qualified, and yet still being unable to do what you can do. So Captain Kirk's still Captain Kirk inside her, the body of a woman. And he's still, the only one who have ever beaten the Kobayashi Maru, and still the youngest captain in the history of Starfleet, still super qualified. And yet he will not be able to exercise those qualifications and those abilities simply because he's a woman.
Yes. And that theme comes back later, and I'm sure we're going to touch on that.
It does. Yeah, yes, it does.
No, just a question about her qualifications. So, we don't know a heck of a lot about what her career was, aside from the fact that she was in the scientific field and she was a doctor. Now, that made me wonder about, her qualification. I know she had been studying starships and schematics. Right. And so, I mean, did she formally go through some sort of Starfleet training to be an officer on a starship? Did she ever have experience in any sort of roles on starships?
Well, that's an interesting question. And I was kind of trying to think about other female characters as a possible answer to that question, because we really don't know that about Janet Lester. And you very rarely see women in gold uniforms anywhere in the original series. And you definitely don't ever see them with captain's braids.
No.
I would be willing, I did not like go back and watch every episode of Star Trek just to verify this, but I would be willing to bet money that there aren't any female captains, commodores, or admirals.
No, you would be correct.
Okay. I was like, I'm pretty darn sure. And even if you look at some of, just in a background character sense, I think maybe only a few times do you see any woman in the command colors, even if she doesn't hold the rank of captain, of course.
True.
So it seems to me like women just don't go into command very often, whether that's by their choice or by Starfleet gently discouraging it or making it extremely difficult. I don't know. On the other hand, you do in the original series versus other later series have people wearing colors other than command in command roles. So Spock, being second in command, still gets to wear science blue, whereas people who are the second in command in later shows are wearing the command color red. So going by command color is a little, or lack thereof, is maybe a little more difficult to do in the original series, but it certainly seems like women just don't go into the command track of Starfleet.
Yeah, if you look at the run of the original series, you are correct. So there are no females in any command roles within Starfleet, but that was one of those things that got retconned in Enterprise, because we saw Captain Hernandez in Home, who was a female captain, before the original series, in the timeline. So if Enterprise had never existed, in the context of the original series, I would definitely say that there was a bias, and there were no females. But I guess we're meant to believe after the retcon in Enterprise that maybe there were female captains or female high-ranking officers in the original series. We just never saw them.
Yeah, technically the dialogue in Turnabout Intruder is just vague enough.
Yes.
That you could interpret it, especially, backwards interpret it as, oh no, we didn't mean that you literally could not be a captain in Starfleet. What she was saying is that Captain Kirk himself was so preoccupied with captaincy that there was no room in his life for a woman. Like, okay, I can see a reading of the dialogue that way, even though it's kind of slim.
Yes, but all the anecdotal and visual evidence presented in the original series would make us believe that there were some sort of restrictions that would prevent women from ascending to those roles.
And the only time I think that you ever do hear about women who are in sort of full status, I don't know what else to really phrase it, in terms of their careers, are doctors.
Right, there's quite a few of those.
Yeah, there are quite a few female doctors, medical doctors, psychologists, other scientists. I don't know if now it would be interesting to know the statistics in the late 1960s, how many female doctors there were in the United States. I know there probably weren't that many, but it would be interesting to know if the medical field sort of accepted or integrated women more quickly than other sort of typical business fields, certainly to faster than the military. I mean, that's...
Well, yeah, the military, that was slow. The typical female role at that point in time was nursing.
Right. I suppose by having maybe Star Trek was actually being pretty forward-thinking and feminist in the sense that it had lots of female doctors, not just nurses. I hate to say just nurses because I don't mean to denigrate nurses, but for the purposes of this discussion, maybe they did have a surprisingly high percentage, and also maybe compared to other shows on television, given the number of guest star of the week for an episode of Star Trek who happens to be a female doctor who is, a fully respected and valued member of the crew or the away team or whatever they're doing that week, compared to other television shows, it may still have been a dramatically progressive portrayal of professional women. I don't know. I just know that Turnabout Intruder sure takes some ugly turns a couple times.
It certainly does. But that what you just said, though, brings up a parallel that I kind of didn't really pick up on too much until you just brought it up, with that the roles of women in the original series does sort of mimic the real world roles of women in the military at the time. Mm-hmm. So women were not, of course, allowed into combat roles and only have just recently been allowed to move into positions of where combat would be a part of their duty. And that only happened in 2014. So back in the 60s, they were stuck in pretty much civilian roles within the military, right, which is pretty much what Star Trek does.
Yeah. And I mean, just looking at other forms of entertainment, not Star Trek, that portray the military, almost always you see women in roles that they don't, either they currently, at the time that the show or movie was produced, they currently could not have, or it was extremely rare, or it had just, like, there were two of them. I think it's really common for us to, as viewers, to get used to the idea of a woman in a combat situation, for example, by having a character in a TV show or a movie that we like be that and portray that successfully. It sort of gets people used to it. I've certainly read articles and been like, oh, that's just now okay. I assume, like, for women being able to serve on submarines, for example. Mm-hmm. I distinctly recall a few years ago reading an article that they had, finally allowed women to be on submarines in the U.S. Navy. And I felt silly for not realizing that this was so new. I kind of assumed this happened 15 or 20 years ago, probably because I saw it on a TV show somewhere. Yep. And it just kind of went into my mind as a thing, even though it really wasn't. So, maybe having Uhura on the bridge, even though she's not in a combat role, maybe that in itself was pretty darn progressive, just as a woman on the bridge of the flagship. There are a few times that you see women in engineering, and a couple of times actually manning the weapons consoles. Mm-hmm. You do see women in, again, probably for the 1960s, some pretty impressive roles. You also have them bringing the Captain coffee all the time.
That's true.
So it's not perfect.
I'm kicking myself because I can't remember the name of the episode, and I should be able to remember the name of the episode. But there was also one episode where there was a woman in Sulu's chair piloting the ship. So was she a blue shirt, or maybe she was a gold? But she did come over and sit in Sulu's chair and flew the ship. I'm gonna have to look up the episode.
If you find the name of the episode, let me know, because I don't remember that. I'd like to go back and watch that.
It's a third season episode for sure.
Okay. Well, and speaking back kind of on the idea that as audience members, we and as a culture, we kind of dabble with ideas in our entertainment and in our fiction and get used to new concepts that way. Mm-hmm. Sometimes before they actually become enacted in real life. And I don't know if it was intentional. I have a feeling it wasn't, but this episode, Turnabout Intruder, unintentionally probably ended up portraying an extremely powerful female captain. Yeah. Even though it is Kirk inside Janet Lester's body, the actress had the opportunity to portray a very rational, level-headed, strong, sort of quietly powerful figure. She was not hysterical. She was not everything that the character, that Janet Lester's mind was while in Kirk's body. And while I was watching this episode again just last night, it occurred to me that if I hadn't known about the body swap, I would have felt like I was just watching Captain Janeway kind of go about her business. In that, and once Spock believes the story that Kirk is inside this woman's body, you see Spock basically taking all these orders from a woman, and it's quite powerful. And I wonder if subconsciously for viewers, this might have kind of planted a notion that this is a legitimate scenario to have men taking orders from women, and having a woman capable of not only giving perfectly coherent orders, but also keeping her cool in a very stressful situation, which is that court-martial, not fighting back, not being bitchy, being assertive without sort of falling into a lot of the negative stereotypes. I don't know. It just occurred to me that I'd love to know if this actress felt like she had the role of a lifetime here, or if she was like, yeah, duh, of course women can be like this. I mean, I don't know anything about the woman who portrayed Janet Lester, but it just struck me as how normal her performance was as someone in 2015 watching this. I'd like to know if in 1969 people looked at her and thought she was playing a very masculine woman, because I didn't think she seemed masculine at all.
No, I don't think she did either. But this is one of the things I really love about this episode, and I think if anybody's listening to this who listened to our commentary episode a while back on Turnabout Intruder, I kind of gushed about the acting in this episode, particularly the Janice Lester character with Kirk inside of her body, and I love the quiet cool, especially of that court-martial scene. I mean, early on in the episode, Kirk inside the body, he's freaking out until he realizes very quickly that he has to play along. And, you see that one scene where Lester's body is lashed to the bed in sickbay, and she's essentially playing Nurse Chapel just to get Chapel to leave the room so she can escape, from the bed. And it's great to see that actually it's kind of Janeway-like that now that you mention it. She reminds me a lot of Janeway now.
I mean, not only does Janet, do you end up seeing this woman calmly, coolly sort of tricking Nurse Chapel, the way that Kirk in Janice Lester's body escapes is she smashes this glass, doesn't even think twice about it, starts cutting through the restraints. I mean, it's a very action-y sequence, but it makes perfect sense. I mean, it's what a person would do. And I think that's kind of when you see Kirk in this female body acting in a certain way, I'm watching this thinking, smart move as a person, not, oh, that's clearly a man in a woman's body, or a woman would never do that, or a man would always do that. It's sort of really become just, what would a person do in that situation? To me, like I said, as a modern viewer, I'm watching this thinking it's a smart choice for a human, as opposed to that's a guy thinking, or a guy would do that. It doesn't strike me as gender specific, but it clearly was written to be very gender specific.
And written in a very different way than most other female characters in the original series had been written. You did not see very many resourceful, independent women in the original series. It's just there's very, very few examples of it. And I went back and looked through. So, and I think that's one of the big contrasts of that character, and why it strikes out as so different and actually more memorable, I think, for that.
Yeah. And on the other hand, you have Kirk, or Janice Lester in Kirk's body, as immediately sort of comfortable we are as an audience with Kirk in Janice's body, everybody on the Enterprise is almost immediately uncomfortable and just like really freaked out by the Captain Kirk they see in front of them acting strangely. And I thought it was really fascinating that essentially female qualities are immediately a red flag. The sort of and these are stereotypical, kind of unpleasantly exaggerated female qualities of being irrational, being kind of petty, not to mention the fact that William Shatner purses his lips a lot, and sits with his legs together, and which I totally dig. I think that's kind of hilarious. I mean, a woman in a man's body absolutely would sit with their legs together in a chair. Or 99% of them would. I think that would be a dead giveaway, but actually you just drop something in their lap, and if they squeeze their legs together to try and catch it, then there's a woman in there somewhere. I'm stealing that one from Mark Twain, by the way. There's our literary reference for the week. But yeah, the fact that everyone is immediately suspicious of Kirk because Kirk is being sort of irrational, and hysterical is a word that gets thrown around a lot, which of course etymologically and historically is extremely female. For anyone who doesn't know, hysterical, or being hysterical, originally referred to a medical condition that the Romans thought was caused by a woman's uterus traveling around in her body and getting lodged into different parts and causing her to act irrationally, and differently irrationally depending on where in her body her uterus was. So by the ancient medical definition, only women could be hysterical. And it was specifically an attribute of being a woman.
I did not know that.
Yeah. So, and that's why hysterectomy and hysterical share the same root word, even though they don't have any real meaning in, the modern sense of the word, in any common meaning. Anyway, so side note, So I think it's quite interesting and appropriate, given the tone of the show, that people call this sort of new version of Captain Kirk hysterical.
And hysterical, not in a comedic way, as a lot of times we use that to mean it's something that's really funny.
Right. No. In this case, it is irrational, just completely out of control, emotionally erratic behavior. Again, this idea that people can almost sniff out a female presence, I think, is very interesting.
But do you think they've registered it as a female presence, or did they register it as there's something wrong with Kirk, that there's something happened to him on the planet, right? And
it's definitely, yes, it's that something's wrong with Kirk, but by association, if it's sort of something's wrong with Kirk's command style, and it's because there's a woman behind the eyes. They may not know that that's why, but the fact that there is this immediate, like, oh, this is weird, this is wrong, and it's not just that Kirk, it's not that his personality is different. It's that his command style, his commands are irrational, and I mean, I think if he had swapped bodies with another man, I think they may have just as, by the end of the episode figured out that, oh, this isn't Captain Kirk. But I think perhaps their reasoning would have been different. Maybe they would have found him out because Kirk suddenly doesn't know things he should know. He doesn't have the same memories or the same, personality. In this case, it's sheer emotional reaction to things. I mean, he's being a very stereotypical kind of exaggerated woman in that respect.
This is something that I picked up on while watching the episode again for this discussion. And I think in the early period, when Lester in Kirk's body first assumes command of the Enterprise, she does a really good job, using the knowledge that she has. She seems to know, how to set a course for she, has actual coordinates in her. Do you think that if the triggers that caused her to lose her composure, as it were, or go hysterical, quote unquote, if Spock hadn't challenged her, if something else hadn't set her off, do you think that she could have actually pulled that off? I think she may have been able to do it.
I think so too. And I think it's really telling that it's not the technical skill that indicates that she as a woman can't do it. It's the fact that she is immediately flustered when she is put in a stressful situation. I think that is a huge indicator of the 1960s mentality of whether or not a woman can be relied upon, basically, in a time of stress to hold a place of authority. Whether it's too delicate, they're too delicate for it. I think it's totally appropriate that it's stress and being confronted with multiple kind of rapid fire questions and people questioning her, that's what breaks through her training. I think it's totally appropriate given the time period in which this is written, and given I'm assuming, the mentality of the person who wrote it and their beliefs and assumptions. There's a bit of dialogue when they're talking about Janice Lester, and in this case, it's Kirk says this. And my note says that it's Lester Kirk who says it, and I honestly can't remember which
I think I know where you're going with this.
But it's Janice Lester has driven herself mad with jealousy, hatred, and ambition. And I think it's so important that the word ambition is in that line of dialogue, because clearly Janice Lester is insane. She is not, she is clearly an unstable person. That has nothing to do with her gender and everything to do with the fact that she is completely obsessive and dangerous. Exactly. But the fact that ambition is included as a trigger for her jealousy and her hatred, that essentially women need to not be so ambitious, that I think is really critical. And that, the idea that women should be happy with what they've got or pleased with their place, that, a woman's place is in the kitchen or this or that, that a woman shouldn't want to go beyond her station in life. She should, and to do so is either dangerous to the woman or dangerous to the people around her, or unpleasant, and I think there's that kind of the common, maybe, I don't know if it's still common, but used to be common anyway, this sort of idea that a woman is being bitchy if she says something But if a man said the same thing, it probably would be perceived as someone just being authoritative.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's this sort of interesting disconnect between, the same thing coming out of a man's or a woman's mouth, the same tone and the same context. They're perceived very differently, or some can be. Hopefully that's changing. Can be perceived very differently depending on who's saying it. And so this idea that ambition in a woman is not only unbecoming, but it's downright dangerous. Whereas ambition in a man is what makes a great Starfleet captain and makes a great man is very interesting to me. And this ties in with the very last line of dialogue, not only in the whole show or the whole episode, but in the entire series of Star Trek, which is like kind of a bummer, is Kirk back in his own body saying, I didn't want to destroy her. Her life could have been as rich as any woman's, if only. So again, if she had just known where her place was and what she had and how good it was, and not striven for more.
I see where you're going with that, and I'm not sure 100% if that was Kirk's intention when he said that, because he had admitted that he was sympathetic to her plight of not being able to be a starship captain. He thought it was unfair that she wasn't able to do it. So I don't know if that necessarily means that he believed that she shouldn't have strived for more and just accepted, what fate had dealt her. I mean, I can definitely see where it would seem like that.
Yeah, and I wasn't sure. I was honestly like 50-50. This could go either way. When she says at the very beginning, it isn't fair, meaning that Starfleet starship captains they don't admit women. When he says no, it isn't, I really couldn't tell if that was a statement of sympathy or if it was more of a like, yeah, well, life's not fair kind of brush off. I honestly could not tell either way which one that was. And I think it's interesting that it sort of could be both or either. There's a lot of ambiguity in the dialogue of this episode. And I don't know if the ambiguity is intentional or if it's caused by me watching this in 2015 and sort of laying my own cultural perceptions because things have changed. I don't know if this was an intentionally ambiguous episode.
Well, I want to believe that
me too
is more. Well, if you look at the intent of the original series, the hopeful and more unified future, I want to believe that that's Roddenberry's statement that everyone should be equal, period. And I want to believe that speaking through Kirk, that he was showing, sympathy and wishing that things could have been different for Lester, because obviously she was talented and like you said, obviously she was insane, and I think that was proven unequivocally by the fact that she murdered her entire crew down on the planet to execute this plot against Kirk. So,
and I mean, you could have made this episode today and just left out maybe 15 words out of the entire set of dialogue, maybe 20, and it would have become just an episode about somebody bent on revenge. It would not have this, just like a few lines of dialogue here and there that turn it, they add that extra dimension of not just here's a crazy person who happens to be a woman, but here's a crazy person who's crazy maybe because she's a woman. The fact that, she's taking revenge on Kirk because he dumped her, that's pretty weak. Yeah. I mean, as a female viewer, I'm like, oh man, but you know what? That is still a very common plot device used today. Mm-hmm. So it's And you know what? There are some women out there who have totally done this, not swapped bodies with people, but gone crazy or become obsessive, really, and the trigger really is because they were dumped by a guy. So I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but it's, it kind of points the viewer's thoughts and attention in a very specific direction, and it's nowadays seems pretty lazy. I don't know then if it was deemed lazy or not. Maybe it was pretty original, but there's that, and there are about the indignity of being a woman. I think the fact that Lester herself seems to have a lot of self-hatred about her gender is really interesting to me, especially tied into the lines of dialogue about ambition being her downfall. I don't know if that was commentary on sort of emerging women's rights movement and this idea that, which I think was pretty common back then, that, people who professed to be feminists were somehow secretly jealous of men or secretly wanted to be men. There was this weird assumption or perception, and not among everyone, I don't think, but I think it was fairly common that women who wanted, to have careers and were somehow rejecting their feminine duty by, if they chose to have a career, they would be neglecting their families. Or how could you be a good mother? How could you do the womanly things if you also wanted to be in the boardroom? This sort of weird dichotomy, which I think is kind of ridiculous. But, in the 1960s, that was a really hot topic and a question that a lot of people were discussing, around their dinner tables. And a question that people, I think, maybe didn't really know the answers to at the time, a lot of them. It was because it was very new. I don't know. I think this episode, in a lot of ways, it kind of plays into some of the more kind of the easier assumptions to make, or that could have been made back in the 1960s about what it meant to be a woman who also craved a position of authority or felt that she deserved one.
The self-loathing that they instilled in this character that you had mentioned, there was one particular line of dialogue that really kind of raised my eyebrow, and I was struggling to understand why this line of dialogue was in the episode. I mean, I guess it's just to drive the point home that Lester just really hated being a woman because she was not able to achieve what she wanted to achieve, and she felt like she was being held back. But it's Lester in the body of Kirk, getting ready to kill Kirk in Lester's body, saying it's better to be dead than live alone in the body of a woman. It's better to be dead.
Right.
That's really out there. It's shocking almost.
It is. And there's another line of dialogue that happens, I think, during the court-martial, and it's Kirk in Lester's body saying her intense hatred of her own womanhood made life with her impossible, referring to the days that they were dating, or the year that they were dating back in Starfleet, back at the Academy. I really do think that that's kind of that may have been a very hot sort of pop culture topic at the time that this was written. And so it might have been extremely topical and kind of seemed like an obvious thing to say to the writer when writing it. I think to us now, it's a little perplexing.
Yeah, the perspective of time and the time that we live in now, things aren't perfect today. I mean, we're still fighting some of these same battles. It's better than it was, but back then it was pretty much a completely different world than it is today. Right. So looking at it with the lenses we have today, it's a very strange to realize that there are people that back then that really felt that way.
Right, and I think there's another exchange that kind of maybe takes the topics in this episode out of the Star Trek universe and back to kind of the dinner table, the family sitting around talking about current events. And it's when Scotty and McCoy are talking about and arranging their mutiny and how they're going to vote in the court-martial. So, Scotty is basically saying, it's so obvious that Captain Kirk is not really Captain Kirk. And McCoy is saying, well, that may be true to us in the room and apparent, but headquarters is going to want some hard facts, and there aren't any. And Scotty kind of rolls his eyes and says, well, headquarters has their problems and we have ours. And I feel like that is, and again, I don't know if this was intentional, but I read that or took that as Scotty is like the man on the factory floor who, the workaday guy, and the boardroom headquarters might want to have like a token woman in charge of the factory because it's going to look good in PR. And they say, well, of course a woman can do it. Studies show they're intelligent, whatever. And then you have like the regular Joe Blow who's just like, yeah, well, headquarters might want to pad the employment numbers with a couple of women to make themselves look good. But we all know this isn't really going to work out because we're the ones who have to deal with them. We see them on a daily basis. And I don't know if that was intentional. I might be reading way into this dialogue, especially considering that Starfleet headquarters doesn't probably have any women at it. But I don't know. It just, that bit, it just sort of struck me as studies can say that they're all right, but I'm not going to believe it until I see it. And what I see right now is not helping me believe it. I don't know. Just kind of felt like that to me. I mean, I hate to accuse Scotty of sexism. It's not intentional. It's just, I don't know.
Now, thinking back on that scene, in fact, I just watched it earlier today, and I don't recall picking up on that. 'Cause I know Scotty's lead into that conversation is talking about how he's seen Captain Kirk in all of these different emotional states, and the one that he's seeing him in now, leads him to believe that Spock's logical conclusion that it is not Kirk in the body, but Janice Lester in the body. I can see where you're going with it now that you talk, now that you say it that way. I can see it in that perspective.
Yeah, I don't know that I would really put up a strong argument for that thesis, but the one that I made, but I just, for the purposes of this show, kind of trying to think about this episode in relation to real current events in the 1960s. And also sort of thinking back about, in some ways, I couldn't help but compare this to the Ultimate Computer in a few ways. And that particular exchange between Scotty and McCoy kind of had me thinking back to the kind of the working man, and whether or not the working man was going to be skeptical for the Ultimate Computer. It's the working man being skeptical of robots. And I wasn't sure if in this case, it's the working man being skeptical of putting a woman in charge. But again, I don't know if it's really in the dialogue, if it's just me picking this out of the dialogue.
No, you know what? Well, Scotty has accepted Spock's conclusion that it is Janice Lester in Kirk's body, and to Scotty, the problem is the captain of the Enterprise, right? So, the problem is now that there's and I don't think at any point in the episode was anybody in the crew of the Enterprise aware that Lester had actually killed or murdered all of her people on the planet. I think only Dr. Coleman knew that.
Right.
So no one exposed her. So he didn't know that Lester was insane, just that she'd taken over Kirk's body for the purposes of commanding the Enterprise.
Right. And they do talk. I mean, clearly Kirk or Lester in Kirk's body's behavior during the court-martial is proof enough in terms of whoever this person is, even if it really is Captain Kirk, they're pretty unstable right now. Like maybe they shouldn't be captaining a starship for the moment, no matter who's doing the emoting. But yeah, they don't have any. I mean, I guess it would be a crime to steal someone's body, even if there's not actually a law against it. I don't know. But yeah, they don't know about her sort of murdering people and attempting to murder Kirk in her own body and all this stuff. I don't think they know about that.
No.
Incidentally, though, you do get this nice little line of dialogue where Scotty says to a woman, "The bridge is where you belong," even though he's really talking to Captain Kirk in Janice Lester's body. It's out of context, a really nice little moment.
And that brings the first part of our Turnabout Intruder discussion to a close. Tune in next week and we'll pick up right where we left off. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you then.